GCC, everyone. Welcome to the fourth annual GCC Recital. So, I wanted to give a little bit of context about how this recital was created. So when I was a junior at Penn a few years ago, a friend and I, actually a non-Christian friend and I, decided to start this recital because, one, he and I wanted to have an opportunity to play through some stuff at the end of the year, but also my friend noticed that there were a lot of kids in GCC who were musically talented, and he said it would be great if you could, showcase that talent in a recital. And I was interestingly at a phase in my own internal life where I was actually spending a lot of time in college thinking about things like what is art and what is music, especially in the context of how Christians should practice these things. So there are a lot of things that I had to think through. For example, people like Thomas Aquinas in church history, Thomas Aquinas said it's better for Christians to come to know God more through things like teaching and discussion rather than art, because art can be very distracting. And art, the idea of art being distracting was very common throughout much of church history. Not only the Catholic Church, but Protestants rejected the idea of doing plays and things like that because the idea of disfiguring your face and pretending to be someone else and doing who knows what was very questionable morally. And then even from a philosophical standpoint, Plato thinks of art as not a great thing because art is imitation. Why follow imitation when you could follow the real thing? Aristotle has a slightly different perspective, which I ended up liking a lot, where he says art is imitation, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing because art also reflects universality to issues in our life that the actual issues themselves don't really fully comprehend. And so he said that, for example, we can have a history of every situation of heartbreak in the world, but writing a song or a poem about heartbreak captures not only a bunch of instances, it captures the entire human experience of heartbreak and loss. And so this idea of art as universality, I ended up realizing could be thought about as art is beautiful when it's something that's striving towards perfection. And when you have that kind of definition, it seems like it's really constricting because then not all music is art. Because some music you just write for a purpose. You write it because someone asked you to write it or because it's in church and you're performing a function. So it doesn't need to be that good. But in other ways, the idea of artist perfection is really liberating because anybody can be an artist without doing what we think of as the arts. So, for example, if I am a basketball player working not only to have good enough moves to score, but he's actually working on refining the perfect form or the perfect plays. That in itself is an art. And fortunately from a Christian standpoint, we can see that, when we think of going towards perfection, as Christians we have the benefit of knowing where that perfection itself is pointing to. And so that was a fairly relieving idea in my head about thinking about art and what it means to make good art and the best art and to continue to make better art, not just as a musician, but as a Christian, as a worker, as an everyday person. As far as the question of why music, for example, is important, because we're having a recital today that's devoted mainly to music. I actually have a hard time answering why I think music itself is particularly special, but I was reading today and I actually stumbled upon a quote by a guy named Olivier Messiaen, who is a very famous French composer, and he's arguably, he's one of the most famous Christian composers in history. So I can close by reading you this quote, which I think is very striking. So he says, "Scientific research, mathematical proof, massed biological experiments have not saved us from uncertainty. Quite the contrary. They have increased our ignorance by constantly revealing new realities within what was believed to be reality. In fact, the one sole reality is of a different order. It is to be found in the realm of faith. Only by encountering another being can we understand it. But to do that, we have to pass through death and resurrection. And that implies the leap out of temporal things. Strangely enough, music can prepare us for it, as a picture, as a reflection, as a symbol. In fact, music is a perpetual dialogue between space and time. Time is a space, sound is a color, space is a complex of superimposed times, sound complexes exist at the same time as complexes of colors. The musician who thinks, sees, hears, speaks, is able, by means of these fundamental ideas, to come closer to the next world to a certain extent. And, as St. Thomas says, music brings us to God through default of truth, until the day when he himself will dazzle us with an excess of truth. That is perhaps the significant meaning, and also the directional meaning of music. So, I pray that through performances and through just a general display of talent, that we think of music not just as something that we enjoy or that we listen to, but it is a space, and a very unique space, where we are able to understand a little bit of the dialogue between things that are material, or things that are seen, and things that are unseen. And I think that is the beauty of music. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first performer.